Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. Thrilled to have you here. Don't go anywhere. We're gonna have a great interview. Join us. You never know what's gonna happen. It is live. So without any further delay, let me introduce you to this week's guest. Today's guest helps organizations and individuals get from where they are to where they want to go. She engages employees, develops leaders, and helps people find meaning on a daily basis, a concept she calls Breadcrumb Legacy. She's a speaker, teacher, and coach. After a 30-year career as a college professor of business management and leadership, she built her own business to share what she's learned. She is the host of the podcast Becoming a Sage, which interviews thought leaders about life and work wisdom, and writes a column for Training Magazine called Leading Edge. She's the author of 6 books. Her latest book is Breadcrumb Legacy: How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jann Freed. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm honored, Robbie. I'm honored.
Thank you so much for joining us from your place in Des Moines, Iowa. It's thrilled to have you. As you know, this is a show about building strong networks, but the context is leadership. So tell me, how do you define leadership, and when did you realize you had the skills to lead?
I developed a definition of leadership as someone who's in a position to influence the lives of others. It could be positive influence, it could be negative influence. So, when I use the word leadership, I used to always think, oh, positive, wonderful. I held an endowed chair in leadership and character development, and how wonderful. But, we all have probably worked under the influence of a bad leader. And so, with that definition, it includes parents, teachers, coaches, pastors, anyone who's in a position to influence the lives of others. Now,
I appreciate that nuance. Yeah.
your second part is, when did you realize you were a leader? I think it took me a long time because I've been teaching. I love to write about it, talk about it, teach about it, but to actually do it, I think it's hard. So I never really thought, oh, I'm a leader. But when I look back on my life and I reflect, I was often the one initiating things and then trying to get people to come along with me, whether it was a church mission trip, which I did twice, an international mission trip. Honestly, I don't think it would have happened if I hadn't really kind of picked up the ball and ran with it and got others involved too. So, whether it's profit or not for profit opportunities, when I look back, it's kind of like, well, I guess I did lead that, or I think I always thought I could influence if I, through my energy or passion or focus. But so again, I want to go back to, if you're in a position to influence the lives of others, then you're in a leadership position. And
Yeah.
I like to
Yeah.
say that the most important person to lead is yourself.
Mm. Fantastic point there. This piece you're describing about how leadership is neither good nor bad.
Mhm.
I think you're the first person in all the episodes I've done who's really sort of driven that point home. And I think you're right that we often think of as benevolent leadership,
Right.
but it's not always. Like
Yeah.
if someone has the ability to have influence over other people's lives, to impact their lives in some way, that may or may not be taking people to where they want to go.
Right. Yeah.
You could be influencing them to not get to the results they want. And so we are hoping to define this in a way that's broader, but to seek out people who are doing this for good.
Right.
And the idea that you have to start with yourself is like a really important message as well. I'm really kind of curious, Jan, about who you were as a kid, because you have done all this work. You've worked with leaders, you write about this, you teach this, you've been doing this work for so long. And
Mhm.
I'm sort of curious about the trajectory that got you into this work to start with. But before we even get to the career side of things, like
Okay.
what were you like as a kid on the playground?
Yeah.
Did you run for school office? Did you like lead the, I don't know, yearbook committee? Did you have teachers who recognize your potential? Like,
Okay.
who were you?
Well, that's such an interesting story, Robbie, because as you mentioned, now I live in Des Moines, Iowa, which is the capital of Iowa. But I grew up in a very small town in northern Iowa. And my graduating high school class was 33, very small. And so I like to say, well, I was in the top 10%, but and I was. but that's not really, it doesn't seem like it's telling you much. And so it's interesting that you asked that question, because I think when I was growing up, you had to do a lot of things because there were not a lot of other people. So I was on the softball team. I was a cheerleader for football and basketball. I was on the track team. But when I look back, I was president of the student council my senior year. I was homecoming queen, but again, I only had 13 girls and there were 5 on the court. So, I mean, it's not like there was, in a sense, there was not a lot of competition. And my friend and I, we were editors of the yearbook our senior year. And so, but again, I don't think I looked at it like, well, I'm a leader. I think I looked at it like kind of default, like, okay, if we want these things to happen, then somebody has to do them. So I think I was somebody who, I do like projects. I've always liked projects. So like the yearbook would be a project. And so, anyway, so that's kind of who I was. I don't think and I don't think I really, I mean, I was close to some teachers because, again, clearly teachers got to know you very well because class sizes were small. I mean, I got the history award, and I think I got a math award. But again, there just weren't there were not a lot of people. So you had to, if you wanted something done, you had to get involved. You didn't have to necessarily lead it, but you had to get involved. So anyway, that's kind of who I was.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because someone else still might have in that position figured out someone else would take the lead.
Oh,
like
that's a good point. But I think what's interesting is particularly the women in my class, and I said there were only 13. Okay, we had a class of 30, and there were 13 women. But all of the women were very, kind of smart, and they would take the initiative. I mean, we got things done. I think the women in the class much more than the men. And when you look at, I think almost all of us went to college, and maybe a third of the men did. So, I think I think I was in a very good class of motivated young women.
And even so, you're the one who ended up in the leadership, like the actual named leadership role, Jann.
That's for many things, not everything.
For many things, yes. But it is kind of cool that even if you weren't necessarily thinking this is like a big competition, or like I had to beat out like 400 people to do this. My graduating class was 1,313.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So
yeah.
A far different thing to be in the top 10%.
Yeah, right.
Or
right,
top
right,
3
right.
as you were. So
actually, I was tied. It was somebody was 1, and then there was a tie
for second.
So I was tied for whatever.
Look at you.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. Like you've always kind of had this, like it has to get done. I'll just jump in. I like projects. You probably also aren't just good at projects, but you're good at team building, I imagine, because the things you're describing, particularly like a yearbook or even like class president, that's not just about an individual leader. It's about a leader inspiring a community to do something. Would you say that's the way you would think about yourself early on?
I have a lot of energy. And when I get excited about something, I think I'm able to excite others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that started at a very young age. But again, I didn't look at it as a leader. It was just kind of, let's do this. And, maybe that's the cheerleader because I was a cheerleader in college too. I think it's just that, and when I say cheerleader, when I was in college, it was more of a yell leader, pep leader. I mean, I can do cartwheels, but not fancy gymnastics like at a big university. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's that pep, that spirit, that cheering people on is what I think I'm probably pretty good at.
When I was in high school, maybe once in early high school, I think I ran for a class position and didn't get it. But in my later years of high school, I got involved with some activism, and I needed some posters to be made. And I asked the person who was the advisor for the student council if they could help. And I ended up coming in, presenting my idea, and having the student council create and spend money on my materials.
That's
And I just
wonderful.
laughed because like I had sort of this ability to have the sort of outside agitator advocate role.
Yeah.
But I wasn't so good at like having the formal role, but the influence was there, right? Like I was
Yes.
influencing, and I'm like,
Yes.
wow, I got all these people who ran for positions to take up energy for my
Which
cause.
is wonderful. That's wonderful.
So when you were 12, 13 years old, what do you think you were going to be when you grew up? Did you have was there like a clearly defined path, or were you still figuring it out?
Probably figuring it out. I'm a first generation college student. So when
Mhm.
I look back, it doesn't surprise me at all that I ended up with a PhD and being a college professor, even though I fell into that. I didn't plan that either. But it doesn't surprise me when I look back because my parents really, really stressed education. You know, I remember, actually, just to show you, my dad said, because remember, I said I came from a small town, and there were many people in my class who did not go to college. They either went to farm because I lived in a farming community or worked manufacturing. And I remember my dad said, now listen, you're going to college. And if you get married when you're in college, we will not pay for it. So the only way we're going to pay for this is if you do not get married. You need to finish college. Well, I didn't even have a boyfriend, so I don't even know where he was getting that. But it was like, but that was how important it was, you know. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do. My dad was a banker. I mean, we grew up in a farming community, but he managed well, I say three small banks, and so it just kind of seemed logical that I would go into some kind of business. So I ended up with a business management major, and then my first job out of college was in the largest bank in Iowa, and I didn't really want to be in banking. And then I fell into teaching. And then I actually got an MBA because, again, I was single. So I had all this time on my hands and the bank was paying for it. So I was like, well, I might as well get an MBA. Well,
Mhm.
then I fell into teaching and I thought, oh, I like this. Well, if you want to stay in teaching, you need a PhD. And then I started a PhD program and then I got married. And so, yeah, I didn't get married for a while.
You took your college advice very
I just
seriously.
kept going to school. I just kept going to school.
He said,
But,
finish school first. And you're like,
and then,
I'm going to get a terminal degree. Okay,
right.
now it's time to get married.
Right. I mean, my dad even said to me, it's okay now. You got 2 degrees. It's okay. You're working
It's
on the third.
okay now.
Yeah. But I and then, so I taught business management and leadership for 30 years. And now I teach a graduate course
Mhm.
for the University of Iowa, just one course.
Well, it seems
Oh,
like your father really influenced you
he did.
even in his own like what he did in the world. Like if
He
he
did.
wasn't a farmer, even though you were
Right.
living in a more rural area,
That's
he
true.
was a businessman. He was
Yes.
managing 3 banks. Like
Yes.
that's not a small job.
Right.
So you are seeing some potential career options that maybe your peers couldn't sort of get at as easily because it wasn't right in front of
Yeah.
them.
Robbie,
Um,
you're very perceptive. That's very true. Yeah.
but it didn't mean that you knew exactly what you wanted to be.
Yeah.
The banking itself wasn't the pull,
Yeah.
even though you sort of ended up falling into that role,
Yeah.
and you had maybe some familiarity with it, but you knew pretty quickly it wasn't your thing. But
Yeah.
this sounds like the skills you were acquiring were to help you really, set yourself up for potentials, for
Yeah, no,
possibility.
I think that's really true. And, again, I've always been kind of ahead of the time in terms of, I would be definitely, probably one of three women in my college courses. So now when I was teaching, they would be even they'd be 50-50 or even a few more women than men. But when I was there, I mean, there were three of us like in these courses. So they were very male dominated. And then all through my career, like might be hard for you to believe, but when I had my first child, which was 1986, um, they didn't have a maternity policy. So, I mean, because the women professors before me were single.
They just
so
didn't do it. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, we haven't run into this before. It was 1986. I mean, we're not talking 1886. I mean,
Right.
so I was always kind of this breaking ground, ahead of my time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you think made you comfortable to do that? Because being the only of a few women in I mean, even like it wasn't quite half of your class, a very small class. You,
Yeah.
what, 13 out of 30. So it was about parity. But
Yeah.
here you are putting yourself in a role where you're like one of a few in a larger room of men taking business classes, probably coming from more affluence if they're like being given the opportunity to go for an MBA, for instance. What sort of set you up? Where do you think you got the strength to be the only or one of a few in a room like that?
Well, there I would give my mom credit because she didn't have a chance to go to college. She actually went to kind of a lab tech school. So, uh, not a nurse, but, trained to do some lab work. And,
Mhm.
my mom was very street smart. My dad lived to be 95 and a half, and my mom lived to be 93. But she was very street smart and really tough. And she really had to kind of make her own way. And so I think I have this kind of rebel part of me. And so when you talk about activism, I've definitely done some marches and some protests and I'm definitely a social justice person. Um,
Mhm.
and one example. So I got married in 1982. Yeah, we just have been married 40 years. And in 1982, I kept my name. I did not change my name.
Wow.
And a lot of my friends were like, you know what, this doesn't surprise me. This makes sense. But they didn't. I was like one of the only. In my peer group, no one else kept their name. Not even really my best friend, who is very smart and went on to law school. Uh, but I said, no, I want to keep my name. And actually, it was kind of interesting why I got that motivation. It's kind of out of laziness because I was working in the bank, I said, and people would come in and they'd say, I was a personal banker at that time, and they came in and they said, well, I'm getting married, so I have to change my checks, I have to change my this, I have to change my name on this, my driver's license. And I said, well, do you have to do that? Well, when you get married, if you're going to change your name, you have to do this. And I go, well, what if you don't change your name? Well, then you don't have to do any of that. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to change my name. Now, what's interesting is I said we've been married 40 years. Well, I've had several friends get divorced during those 40 years, and several of them who really found what I did kind of shocking went back, even after 25 years of marriage, went back to their maiden name. So they're
Wow.
kind of like,
Yeah.
Freed, I think you were onto something, you
I,
know?
I mean, that's definitely another example of you being ahead of your time,
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
where
I know. Exactly.
you
So
were sort of
again, it
willing.
wasn't like I intended to do that, but it was like I just didn't see any reason to change my name. I had been known by this name all through college and beyond because I
Mhm.
didn't get married till I was almost 28. So it's like, which now doesn't seem that old, but at the time, 22 or 23 was probably the average. Um, but it was just kind of like, no, I've been known by this name. Why would I want to change it? So anyway, it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you had a professional attachment with the
Yeah,
name
I
as
did.
well, like
I did.
that.
And I only
Yeah,
have a sister, so I don't have any brothers. So, and my sister kept her name. So, it was kind of like we want to carry on the family.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do your kids have hyphens?
My maiden name is each of their middle names, but it's not
Nice.
hyphened. So and actually when they were little, I trained them to use their middle name along with their last name. So my name's Freed, my husband's name is Fisher. So I would say to my son, okay, you are Mac Freed Fisher. So, here would be this little kid and he goes, my name is Mac Freed Fisher. But, like there's Mary Ellen, Mary
Yeah,
Ellen or Mary Beth or,
that's great.
yeah.
That's
So,
great. The name is kept alive.
yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just these are great examples of sort of you finding your own path, but it also sounds like you got the business degree, you fell into banking because it was in your area probably the best opportunity for sort of stepping out of what was sort of the
Yeah.
common circumstance.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily your calling, but it got you in a different world.
Yes. Yes.
Once you were in that world and you realized it wasn't quite the right fit for you, how did you figure out your next move? Like
Yeah.
what transpired or ignited a
Well,
change?
I'll tell you, you ask very good questions. Well, once again, I was kind of a rebel. Okay. So here I am. I'm working. I'm, personal banker. I'd gone through the management trainee program. I'm working in the largest bank in Iowa, and we had to sign out to go to the bathroom. And I'm like, sign out to go to the bathroom? I mean, this just seems like prison. And I mean, they had these kind of rules that just made you feel like you were in a cage. And I am not that person. I am not that person at all. So, so I even went to my manager. We would get 45 minutes for lunch. And this is a professional position, but we could have a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon. So I went to my manager and I said, can I have an hour for lunch and I'll give up both breaks? No, we can't do that. And I'm like, you know what? This is not for me. So I started the MBA program, and the bank, I said, was paying the tuition. And then a college called me and said, well, we hear you're getting done with your MBA. Would you want to teach? And I said, well, I've never taken any education courses. Oh, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Now, I always say to people, if you've ever had a bad professor in college, it's because they're not trained as teachers. Okay, I didn't know that at the time. So one of the things, like you mentioned my books, well, several of my books are written about teaching and learning. One book subtitle is called Shifting the Focus from Teaching to Learning, because while I really like teaching, I'm passionate about learning. So my personal mission statement is to continue to learn and share what I'm learning with others. And I filter everything that I get asked to do through that lens. So am I going to learn something? And if I'm not going to learn something, like I just got off the planning and zoning for the city, which is it's not an elected position, it's an appointed position. And I learned a lot, and I was on it for 11 years, but I don't need to stay on it for 25 years. I mean, it's like, okay, I learned a lot and now I want to learn something else. Mm-hmm. So that's why I have a podcast. I don't make money on it. I mean, people will say, well, do you make money on it? No, it costs me some money because I have to pay someone to
totally understand that.
Yeah. So I'm doing it to learn. That's my point.
Yeah. So I feel like you, this opportunity to teach that came to you, I feel like your initial response is also a somewhat socialized, gender-wise response, because men never question their capabilities or whether they have the qualifications.
You're probably right. I just didn't know that you didn't need to know about teaching.
Yeah, you're like, what? I don't have an education background. Right. But you had something to teach, and you were giving. I mean, what led to that opportunity? Like, how did that person know to reach out to you?
Okay, so where I taught for 30 years is my alma mater. So somebody had said to them, because I was a good student, and somebody had said she's getting her MBA, she's finishing her MBA. Now I couldn't have stayed teaching unless I got a PhD, but I could start teaching with an MBA. So I had connections because they knew I was an alum. Yeah.
Yeah. But you were a good student. You stood out. Someone remembered you. Yeah. They essentially sponsored you the way we now think about sponsorship.
That's a good way.
They brought your name forward at the moment that people were debating a conversation about who should fill this role. Yeah. And they were like, well, why not give it to, yeah.
I will also say they were desperate because the professor that I replaced was a real superstar. And he left the college in the middle of the summer to become dean of Texas Christian Business School or something like that. And so he left to be a dean. And so they had like a month to find somebody. So they were desperate at the time, but I had to prove myself in order to keep the job. So
yeah. I actually taught at a college level for a few years. I have an MSW, which for teaching is actually considered a terminal degree because so few have doctorates in the subject. Yeah. And most who don't teach, they go into policy. Right. But like you said, it's a very interesting experience. I had background as a community organizer and running workshops and professional speaking. So like I had to pull from all of that, but it wasn't like they said, do you have any teaching background? Like I had a lot of ideas around what does it mean to help communicate an idea in a way that people get it. Right. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It was actually on community organizing. It was a really great topic. Nice. But, at what point do you realize teaching's your calling and you decide to go for the doctorate? Like, did you know right away that this was a good fit?
Well, early on, now again, I wasn't married the first year, and then I got married the second year, but we didn't have kids for a while. It was just so fun. I just loved it. Now, remember, I was only like 4 years older than the seniors. So it was pretty challenging because, here's this young, relatively short, blonde woman. So the first couple of years were tough, but yet it was just like I always loved college. So it was like being back in college again. So then, so I would say after about 4 years, then they said, really, if you're going to stay here, you need to start a PhD program. So, yeah, so I would say 3 or 4 years.
This is really interesting because just, 8 years earlier or 6 years earlier or something, you were among one of the few women in the class.
Yeah,
And
right.
now you are the professor of the class. As
And
probably women start to take the classes more and more, they're now seeing you up front. Like, did you have any female teachers when you were in school?
uh, not in business.
Hmm.
Now I went to a liberal arts college, so
But
I
outside of business classes, but not in the business classes.
no,
Wow. I mean, that's another example of you being really on that front edge of change
that's true.
and
And
being willing to break that barrier, including, I mean, being in a male-dominated room of students who are very
right,
entitled,
right, and
uh,
male-dominated department because I was
in
the
the
only female
department.
in the department.
Right.
And then let me see. So I had my first son in like 4 years. I had my son right as I was kind of finishing my PhD. But then no maternity policy.
Right.
I mean, it's like,
'Cause they
so
hadn't thought of
really,
that.
yeah, kind of cut. I mean, even when I got promoted to full professor, there was no bump in salary.
Hmm.
And I said, I don't understand this. And they said, well, you should be glad that you got promoted because you also got tenure. And, not everybody gets tenure. And I'm like, well, tenure and a title does not pay your bills. So anyway, so it's crazy. Now they get, I don't know, $5,000 to get promoted. But I was
Yeah.
always just a little bit ahead, which was always kind of to my disadvantage, but whatever.
But you also have that sort of activist streak, so you're probably were pushing for
True.
parity
That's
and
true. I believe me, I ruffled some feathers in a
but
very
you stayed for 30 years, so
but
you also have the
I stayed.
longevity. I
Yes,
mean,
I
change
stayed.
doesn't happen. I say this all the time. Change within these major institutions, these like, centuries long institutions doesn't change in a few years. It's decades.
Right.
And so you really were there and not just witnessing, but also probably very much a catalyst for a lot of that change. And I also know probably students coming in today will feel like, there's so much more work to do
Yeah. Now,
with no
you're right.
appreciation of what's
I
happened.
will say because of my situation, and we don't have enough time to go into it, but a maternity policy did come about
Yes.
because of my first pregnancy and that situation. Yeah.
Right.
Because by this time, there were other women, not in my department, but on campus. And they were very upset that because they were, my age, actually, a couple were a little bit older, but everybody was kind of thinking about starting a family. And they were like, so anyway, the
Yeah.
women bonded together and made a policy happen. So,
Which is an excellent example that women coming in today wouldn't have to think twice about whether or not there's a policy, but someone had to push
yep.
for that, have that lived moment of it not being there and needing it. So, I mean, this is a great example of the work you did way back then that is still relevant today because it's some other policy that has to change. Like there's always some new forefront that we have to kind of push a little bit. You left a 30-year career teaching to focus on a business, and you'd already had some writing under your belt. You already were, published author and all. Well, I say published author. I should say author. You're already an author.
Yeah.
What led to the decision to really shift that focus and start to build your own brand, your own, you're like,
Yeah.
this is the thing I can offer as me, not as me associated with this institution?
Okay. Again, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, I live in Des Moines, and where I was teaching was an hour away. Okay. Now, in a big city, it could take an hour to get from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Okay. But I was driving 50 miles each way. So I was driving 100 miles a day. So it's not like I was stuck in traffic. No, I was on the move. But I had a long way to go. And so, in like I didn't plan to stay 30 years, but with three sons, and as they grew up, um, the biggest benefit that we get in a small liberal arts college is what they call tuition exchange. Now, it's not an exchange as much as it is a scholarship program. So, but I was fortunate that two of the three sons selected a college on the list and they got the tuition scholarship. And the third one selected a college not on the list, a little more selective. He would have received it also, but they're not in the exchange. And that's a huge benefit. So the closer they got to college, it's like, well, I shouldn't leave now because that's my biggest benefit, you know?
Who would have thought when you were just getting started in this career and hadn't yet started a family, and then you're just having your first kid that, my wife and I joked about that because she was in higher ed when we met, and I moved into campus with her. She was a
Uh-huh.
director of residence life, and we were like, okay, and then we started having kids while we were living there, and it was like, so is this the 30-year plan? That's kind of what happened to you. And for us, it ended up not being that way, but the idea to just sort of be in the role. You don't leave. I was in a job for 10 years and people would say, like, how'd you do that? I'm like, you don't leave. Like, it's
Yeah.
actually pretty easy to stay in a job. It's
Yeah.
harder to leave jobs every 3 years.
Yeah.
But that you got close enough that it made sense to hold on to that benefit, which is a fantastic benefit. But
It
then what was the itch to build your own thing? I mean, I understand not necessarily staying in the institution, but you didn't move to another like
right.
in-house role.
Okay. Well, first of all, I stayed most of the tenure I was there. I stayed because I loved it.
Mm.
Okay. And then I did get kind of an itch because it's like, you know, maybe I'd like to practice this instead of, but higher ed is, tenure can be kind of a golden handcuff, like ball and chain. Like, how could you give up tenure because it's so job security? Now, things are changing in higher education. It isn't like it used to be, but how could you give that up because you work so hard to get it? And, you practically have to kill somebody to lose tenure. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it really is, at least in a small liberal arts setting, it really is a great lifestyle for kids because I didn't have the pressure to publish. Yes, I did publish, but I didn't have to. And I think that was an advantage. It was easier for me to publish when I didn't have to do that.
Hmm.
But yet, I had summers really free to do that. I had flexibility. I mean, I didn't have to stay to 5. I didn't have to be there till 8. It usually meant bringing work home. But, I really was kind of the commander of my own destiny. I was my own boss. As long as I'm performing well and my students are, my students are learning and I'm getting good evaluations and I'm my own boss. And that was really valuable raising 3 kids 50 miles away. So my husband really was Mr. Dad. He was Mr. Dad during those times, or Mr. Mom or whatever. But that's why I stayed. But then when they got out of college, it was time for me to do something. I don't want to drive 100 miles a day. I don't have to stay there. And now that they were out of college, it's like, well, we can afford to take a risk. And so that's when I started, doing more consulting and building a business.
You actually sound a lot like the coaching clients I work with because I tend to work with entrepreneurial women in their 50s and beyond who are ready to, launch some sort of new product or service, some sort of new revenue stream. And that phrase you were just saying, it's like, it's your turn, it's your time. The kids are raised, they're done, they're launched, they're out into the world doing what
Yeah,
they're going to do, done your best. And it's interesting because it does sort of fall on gendered lines, because most men are not thinking, okay, now that the kids are out of the house, now it's my turn. It does sound like you had a lot of help at home compared to maybe other women in your generation, which is
yeah,
wonderful. It gave you some space and latitude. But you had some freedom, like you said, some security. The kids were out of school. You could take some risks. So the business idea seems become almost more plausible. And
That's
it wasn't a huge shift. You were actually very entrepreneurial in the way you were working all those
that's true.
years.
That's true.
So you
That's a good
probably,
insight.
you definitely didn't want to be clocking in and out to go to the bathroom. So
No, no, no.
you wanted to have your own destiny, and you were running your life that way as a professor. So it probably wasn't as much of a shift in that way. What was the shift? Was it a mental shift? Were there things about running a business that you needed to ask other people for support around? Like, you knew a lot. I mean, you were teaching this, but where did you need to kind of fill in your knowledge gap, or maybe make a mental shift?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. For me, the hardest part is marketing. Now, I taught some marketing courses. It's not about how to market, it's just time. Where do you spend your time? Because I love, like, I'm involved in a big leadership consulting project now with a manufacturing firm 2 hours away, and they were having union issues, and now they want someone to come in and help rebuild the culture and train leaders and uh, do some healing. That is what I love to do. Now, that happened because of a connection, a network. So I feel very lucky because, that was like a referral. Referrals are great, but having to go out and market myself and figure out ways to market myself, try to navigate social media, that's the hardest part.
Yeah, that's the difference probably between working with an institution, even in an entrepreneurial way.
Mhm.
They were finding students for you.
Yep.
They were helping you market your classes,
Yes.
right? You didn't have to do that part. You just had to fulfill the work,
Yeah.
and
At a
get the good
small
emails.
college, you have to do more recruiting than you think. But I
Yeah,
didn't mind that because,
yeah,
I'm not out on the road recruiting. Students
right.
would come to me.
Yeah.
Um, but the marketing as a business owner, that's tough. Yeah.
And also it's a shift because it's about you. It's not about an institution. So there's also that piece around, I think, again, in a somewhat gendered, socialized way, like how women feel about marketing themselves, self promotion, and like how it gets sort of a bad rap, even though it's about value proposition, not
Right. But
braggadocious.
it feels self-centered.
Yeah,
It feels a little like narcissistic, like I'm always trying to get something from me when that's not really the case. But you
right.
have to stay visible. So anyway, that's the hardest part for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a fine line because you want to be of service, but if people don't know what you can offer them, then you can't have the impact. So
Right.
there's a way in which you have to sort of put yourself out front. When I taught networking and fundraising, there was a line from the fundraising world that I would always share, which is that in fundraising, they say if you're scared to sort of make the ask, you need to kick yourself out of the way and let the cause talk. And I
Yeah.
feel like it's similar when it comes to networking and sales and promotion. It's
Right.
it's not about you,
Yeah.
but it's about this thing that you can offer and the way we might be able to support you. So
Yeah.
it's an evolution I think that all of us
Yeah.
have to go through.
Well, that's a good point.
So what point did you really focus on this being a business? How long have you been in the business part of this
Well, so I
yourself?
left full-time teaching in 2011.
It's
So
been a
I've
while.
been at
Yeah.
this for a while. And, the first couple of years, it was just kind of getting set up. And, I rent an office space. So, having an external office outside of the home,
Mhm.
and making some connections, joining some, I try to meet some of my connections one on one to let them know what I'm doing. And plus after a 30-year career, I kind of wanted to relax a little bit. I was teaching a graduate course. So I don't want to say, I think I would say I didn't work that hard at building the business the first couple of years, just
Mhm.
kind of getting established. And then um, I actually hired Maria in Contrera
Mhm.
to help me with some social media. And Maria's great. And then she helped me get a local TEDx talk, and which was great. It was local, but still, I don't know if I would have gotten it without her coaching.
Mhm.
And then, I've had some good referrals, made some connections, had some good referrals. And it's kind of interesting because I'm finally sensing some momentum.
Mhm.
Now, again, I don't really have to do this in a sense. I mean, a lot of people in my stage of life would say, why work so hard? Why does it matter? Well, it is a calling. And I do feel like I have something of value to offer. And after teaching for 30 years, I'm having so much fun really helping people do it,
Mm-hmm.
So, um, anyway, I guess
Yeah, that's great. No, you're at the praxis moment.
yeah,
It's seeing all these ideas in action
yes,
after them just being concepts in the ivory
yes,
tower. It's very different,
fun. It's
and the real world implications of it also is probably really interesting to you.
right.
I love that you sort of just started to slowly establish yourself, your brand, who you served, but that you sought out some help. We connected through Dory Clark's Recognized
Yes,
Expert community. So some of the things you were just mentioning, like hiring Maureen Contreras,
yeah,
getting your handle on social media, getting the TEDx opportunity, which, by the way, no one knows whether it was local to you or not. They just know you did TEDx, which is
right.
awesome for branding. I mean, this is all positioning yourself as someone who has recognized expertise, and that's what's going to attract people to the work that you're doing. Are there specific ways you're nurturing that larger network? Because you've got this great career, a lot of people you've met both through Dora Clark's community, through your years of teaching. There's the folks you're really close to, and then there's the people you might see, I don't know, once a year at a conference, or 5 years ago you had a reason to work together but not since, but you
Yeah,
like each other. So how do you think about staying in touch and nurturing those kinds of connections? Any habits, philosophies, practices?
sure. No, for me, LinkedIn is the best
Mm.
platform. Okay. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Until now, you might find this really odd, Robbie, but until I joined the Rex community with Dory Clark, I was very proud of the fact that I was not on Facebook. So it's like, oh, I have to be, I remember Marie saying, this would be really good for you. Now you're on Facebook. I said, well, no, I'm not really on Facebook. Well, Jann, you're gonna have to be on Facebook. So I was very proud of the fact that I was not on Facebook. So, but I would say for me, LinkedIn is the best platform. And I really have tried to connect with 30 years of former students. I'm in a women's executive group that's local, and these are pretty high powered women in town. I feel fortunate to be in that. I joined the Rex group. I've made some really good connections there. People, and not even connections, but just I find them inspirational. It's like, okay, well, they're doing that. Maybe I can do that. So, or if I have a question, I'm not hesitant. This kind of goes back to my rebel part, but I don't hesitate at all to reach out to someone and say, can we talk about that? Or can I, or I'll respond to somebody else's question. Yeah. I may not have an answer, but I'll be willing to talk with you about that, have a conversation. In terms of social media, again, I'm still not wild about Facebook. I'm messing around a little bit with, I occasionally do stuff on Twitter, but I'm not a real Twitter person.
Yeah.
And I'm now doing some things on Instagram, but I might just use that as more of a creative outlet.
Hmm.
Anyway,
It sounds like you're thoughtful about, staying in touch, supporting people, asking for help, offering help. I mean, I think this is partly just in your nature. It's probably how you got where you are in your career and your business, and you're just doing that in support of your network in
yeah,
large.
I think, again, I always say leadership is not a position and it's
Hmm.
not a title, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
Because you can't have influence unless you have a relationship.
Hmm.
And it's all about trust. And you can't trust people unless you know them.
Right.
So it goes back to relationships. Yeah.
So a year from now, I'm gonna try to remember that you and I had this hot conversation, and
Okay.
I'm gonna be like, Jan, do you remember a year ago I interviewed you? And I'm gonna ask you a year from now, what's noteworthy? What should we be celebrating for you? What are you most looking forward to in the year ahead? What will you be telling me a year from now that you were so excited about for this coming
I
year?
hope that I'm telling you that my book, Breadcrumb Legacy, How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering, I hope that I'm telling you that, I've had several keynote opportunities at major conferences or associations. And out of those presentations, I've been hired to do some workshops. My One of my role models in life, Robbie, is Dr. Ruth. Dr. Ruth, the sex therapist, or, I don't know her official title, but Dr. Ruth is 94 years old. I've met her in person twice. At 94, she's still speaking, she's still writing, and that's what I hope to be doing at 94. Now I have a long ways to go before 94,
That's amazing.
but
Yeah.
I'm hoping that my book takes off. I hope it resonates with people. I hope it makes, I hope people who read it, I hope it changes their life like it changed mine.
Oh my gosh. I can't wait to celebrate all of that with you. How can people find you and follow your work?
Okay. So, like I said, LinkedIn is the best way to follow me. My website is just jannfreed.com, 2 N's and 2 E's. If you go to my website, if you subscribe, which is free, I have a monthly newsletter that people find interesting because it's kind of a quick read. But I'm sharing what I'm learning. And then if you subscribe, you would get my monthly podcast where I interview these thought leaders. And I've learned a lot from Robbie here. So hopefully I'll make some improvements on my podcast. And then if you take Training Magazine or if you Google Training Magazine, I have a regular column called Leading Edge. So those are probably the best ways. Go to my website and that'd be great.
Fantastic. We put all the links in the show notes at ontheschmooze.com. Jann, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.